So we're going to talk today about document design and sort of graphical elements of technical communication. These things, I think, kind of go together because they're both sort of visual aspects of technical communication, but they're also more than that. As you'll find when we talk about document design, it really has a lot to do with organization, which we talked about a couple of weeks ago. So a lot of these technical communication concepts kind of come together in different ways. And so that's what we're going to be talking a bit about here, as well as about this week's assignments. So when we're talking about document design, essentially what we're talking about is how does the document look, whether it is a printed page or a digital page or anything like that. How does it all look? And that includes words, images, empty space, color, organizational features, typeface, all that stuff. And when we think about document design, it really does serve two functions. On the one hand, there is an aesthetic element to it. When you look at a document, you make judgments about it. People say, don't judge a book by its cover. But the reality is we do judge books by their covers. And in fact, it is a, million-dollar industry to design effective book covers for books to get people to buy those books, because it does contribute to the potential user's immediate response to that thing. And so document design works the same way. When you look at a document, before you have even read a word, the way the page looks affects how you feel about that document. So as an example of that, oops, wrong tab, here we go. This is a document that's in our textbook in the chapter on document design. And I have this zoomed out, so you might or might not be able to read the words very well depending on how big your screen is. But that's not the point. The point isn't to read the words. The point is to ask you guys, when you see this page, what is your sort of immediate response, sort of emotionally, or to how you feel like this page is? Does it look like it's something interesting? Does it look readable? So we got one response. Caleb just has you. So yeah.
It looks
Any
cluttered.
other sort of things when you just look at this page you think about? Yeah, we see a lot of numbers pulled out, and it's interesting how the numbers pop more than the words, isn't it? And when you see a lot of numbers, statistics, I mean, what does that make you think about the document? Is that like a plus, a minus? Does it seem appealing? Does it seem interesting? Thumbs down? Yeah, I mean, some people love numbers, right? I like how Edward puts it, not as digestible. I think that's about right. And I think that looking at a document like this, it doesn't seem digestible, or to use a different adjective, accessible, right? You may have a positive impression seeing the statistics that it may seem factual or informative, which I think generally speaking is good, but perhaps intimidating, right, in a lot of other ways. So in this case, this sort of first impression that we get from this and this document's design is not necessarily positive, right? So we'll come back to this to think about, maybe what would be some things we could do to this to make it not so terrible. So there is an aesthetic element, that it may just look bad or good, but there's also an accessibility element. When something is designed effectively, it looks digestible, to take Edward's term. It seems like something we could use to find what we're looking for, right? Or we could navigate it relatively easily. So it doesn't have to necessarily be pretty or flashy or snazzy, but it does need to be something that looks approachable, I guess we could say. So as someone creating a piece of technical communication, we need to use document design features and principles to help that to be the case, to help the person who's viewing our document to feel like it is digestible and it is something that is going to meet their information needs. Sometimes it also is important that the choices we make fit the genre or type of document as well, because there are often expectations associated with certain kinds of documents. So as a rule, because there's so many kinds of technical communication, again, we have sort of general principles and not like a one-size-fits-all approach. There are certain, I don't know, types of things we want to think about as we're thinking about designing our document. And so that's the 4 general sort of categories or strategies that we think about are on this page. And we're going to kind of go through them one by one, what that means and you know, in terms of physically how that's going to be potentially applied. So when we talk about shaping the page, what we're talking about is the overall layout of the page. That's what we mean by a grid. So we might see a document, for example, that has what we call a horizontal grid, which means that the text goes sort of back and forth from side to side on the page, like a letter, for example, usually uses a horizontal grid. Or if I'm reading a novel, it's probably got a horizontal grid. On the other hand, sometimes we'll see documents that use a vertical grid. So that means that they use columns. They may be columns of even width, or they may be asymmetrical. So for example, newspapers tend to have a vertical grid sometimes, or sometimes a mixed grid where parts of it are horizontal and parts are vertical. Certain other kinds of documents, like a lot of journals, may use a vertical grid. Web pages often have a main portion of the page that is mostly horizontal, but then they'll have a more narrow sidebar. So there's a lot of ways that we shape information just by the overall layout of the page, and it also kind of indicates to the user maybe what's primary and what's secondary if we're making choices about an asymmetrical grid or some sort of mixed grid. Other ways we shape the page include using things like paragraphing, which we've talked about before, and lists. And those are things that really can make a document a lot more readable. A list is something that is so much easier to scan than just a big block of text. But the other way we shape the page is by the things that we don't put on the page, by the negative space or white space. So that's going to include things like margins and spacing, but it can encompass, you know, other elements too. The more complex the information you're sharing, the more negative or white space you need on the page, because you need to sort of break up intimidating information into more manageable chunks. You need to give the viewer's eyes a chance to rest a little bit. So what is not on the page is just as important as what is on the page. So that's what we mean when we talk about shaping the page. Multiple factors apply there. Then we also need to think about, when there are words on the page, what choices are we making stylistically in terms of those words. So that usually means choosing a particular typeface or font. And we often will choose a serif font if we're trying to create a document that's meant to appear very formal or traditional. Serif fonts can also be good if you have a lot of information on the page. But a sans serif font is going to have a bit more of a clean, modern look, and it can be more desirable for online content. Again, there's no one size fits all. The main thing is we usually do want some consistency in these choices because it makes our communication seem more legitimate and less random when things are consistent in terms of the typeface choices. Sometimes things like headings and titles are going to be a little bit different or a little bit decorative, and that is not unusual, especially if it's in line with institutional branding. But as a general rule, we want to keep things fairly unified in terms of our approach, and we want to use a pretty standard typeface and type size. You definitely want to reserve your decorative or handwritten typefaces for signatures or our very small use. The other thing we might want to do in terms of styling our words is adding features like boldface, italics, or color. And those are things that, as we've discussed a little bit briefly in previous weeks, can help things sort of pop out a bit more, which can be a really useful strategy in certain situations to call the viewer's attention to some information. But it's also a case where less is more. So you definitely don't want to overdo it with a lot of these features. You want to make sure you're restricting it to just the elements that require it. And you definitely want to avoid all caps. As I think most of us know, we don't want to look like we're yelling at our audience. Headings are an organizational and design strategy that are used very widely in technical communication. And again, we touched on that briefly last week when we talked a bit about emails and how even in an email situation, using features like headings can occasionally be appropriate and beneficial. But there are a wide range of documents that will benefit from using headings to organize the information and make it really easy for the user to sort of scan the document and find what they're looking for. It adds to accessibility. It can also be important for a different kind of accessibility to, when you're making your headings, to use the sort of built-in heading structure or title structure in your word processor, because using those sort of official heading systems will help with universal design. And in particular, anything that's posted online should ideally use official headings as opposed to just increasing your font size. Because it will help a screen reader for, say, a visually impaired person indicate that this is a title or this is a section heading. So it can be an important consideration for electronic documents. Obviously, things that are getting printed out, it doesn't matter quite so much. So some of these choices are things that will help accomplish certain tasks for our audience. So for example, if you know that someone is going to just use your document as a reference document as opposed to going to read it from start to finish, it can be really important to have a lot of headings. That way the reader can just identify the part that's relevant to them and go straight there and skip all the other parts that aren't relevant. If you know that it's really important that the viewer or reader follows a series of steps or actions, then it's going to be very important to have a numbered list to reinforce the sequence that must be followed in a correct order. And using a numbered list streamlines and simplifies conveying that information because you don't have to say it in words. If you have something in your document that needs to provide some kind of warning, then in addition to using forceful language, use some sort of typographical or design feature to highlight that warning. So that might be using boldface or using color, like red, for example, something that's going to make that warning really stand out and be unmissable. If your reader is using the information in your document to make a decision or evaluate something, you might want to present it as a checklist. Again, that's a much simpler way to convey information than writing a whole lengthy paragraph about something. and the user can use your checklist to just go down the list and evaluate whatever it is in terms of the criteria. If you've been asked to provide something on one page only and you've got a lot of information to convey, well, maybe you'll need to use a smaller type size. You just don't want to get smaller than 10 because at that point it can get kind of hard to read. And if you're conveying a lot of information that might be highly specialized or technical or complicated in some way, make sure there's a lot of white space on the page. So that might be between paragraphs, between sections. It might mean that your margins are adequate margins so that people, if it's a print document, have a place to jot down notes. If it's a virtual document, it gives their eye a chance to rest, and it makes your document appear less intimidating. So these are things that we're doing to make the information we're conveying more readily conveyed to our audience. So if we go back to this document, what are some design things we could do here to make this document more effective for users, make it more approachable and more understandable? I think adding a space after each paragraph would be really important because this is just so pinched up. Bold, important information, yeah, could definitely be useful. I think Caleb's ideas about using subheadings is really important too, because this is obviously discussing different topics related to COPD. That's what it's about, is the disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. So subheadings would help clue us into particular pieces of information where we could find it. Use a serif font, not a sans serif. So that could be useful too. Because for some people, for more complex information, a serif font could be easier to read. For some people, a serif font, if they're dyslexic, can be a little bit trickier. So that can be definitely more of a judgment call. Adding figures or charts. So charts might be a good way to convey some of this numerical information, right? And we'll talk more about charts a little bit later today. Because, yeah, pulling numbers out of prose text, it's not always easy to do. One little comment I'll make based on what Caleb had to say is a difference between headers and headings. So a header is actually something that goes up the very top of the document, sort of in the top margin. And a heading is a little kind of title for a portion of a document. So there's a little bit of a difference there. So, but, and this document could use both. It could use a header and it could use some headings. All right. So I think those are some good suggestions. Definitely more white space. So that would be even if we didn't change information. And there is a revision of this document in the textbook on the next page that does a lot of these things. So here I've still got it zoomed out. We can't necessarily read it very well unless you've got a big screen. But I think in terms of just like looking at this, what is it doing? It's doing the things we talked about, right? It's added space after each paragraph. It has got more white space in the document as well, dividing things into sections and using section headings like what is it, what causes it, who has it. It does not use figures and charts though. So, and it still conveys a lot of numbers, especially in the who has it section. And I think that might have been a much more appealing and almost more intuitive way to present that information, perhaps. A couple other things that we can see on this revised version of the document is it has headings and also, sorry, not headings, header, it does have headings too, but it has a header and a footer, and those are things that are providing institutional branding as well as providing sort of a title or subject information. So with the header at the top of the document, we know this is an official CDC document. Whereas when we looked at the original version back here, we don't. It says this is from the CDC, but there's nothing that, just glancing at the page, we can tell that, and maybe this isn't official. Now down here with this organizational branding, we know it's official. It looks more legit. Another thing that this document design here shows is a bit of color used. And that color is used both in the subheadings throughout the document, and that helps those headings to pop a little bit more. But it's also used in the header and the footer. And again, that contributes potentially to institutional branding, similar to the way that so many things that we see coming out at University of Houston are using red, in some of their parts of the document. A lot of the things in terms of the headings and the headers and titles are going to be using red because that's the organizational color associated with University of Houston. So I think that even though this information is still very dense and it probably could do more in terms of things like adding figures or charts, this is like 100% more readable than the version up here, simply because it's employed some pretty basic document design strategies. And that's before they've even edited for concision or done anything that's more graphical. So this is partly by way of saying, going forward in many of our assignments for this class, it's going to be important that you look at your documents through the lens of, would this benefit from employing particular document design strategies? Not just organization into paragraphs, which we've talked about and which is important, but would this document benefit from things like headings? Would this document benefit from color or from the use of bullet point lists or things like that? And it's something that we will see in many things related to technical communication. So going forward, have that expectation to look for that. It's not always going to be relevant, right? When you're writing a letter, you're probably not going to be doing a lot of color and bullet points or whatever. But in other kinds of documents, you will. So that leads us then to sort of the next level,